this is actually the beginning.
The issue of atheism and religion is one that I haven't touched upon so far, and I feel like it's time I've done so. The cultural sphere that we belong to is largely the creation of what is called the New Atheists, atheists who are aggressively fighting to spread atheism, mainly through the internet. The New Atheist community was unified in its fight against religion, but then, in the beginning of this decade, a split occurred in it, between atheists who are liberals and those who are regressive social justice warriors. This then became the main culture war that occupies the New Atheists, and in the process, the liberals found themselves suddenly allied with some religious folks, who share the liberal views and the disdain for SJWs. This causes some confusion, so it's time to take a look at this issue. Now I am what you might call an atheist. You might call it that, but I don't call myself that. And that is because I am so beyond this question that it has no relevance to me. Theism is not in my horizon of possibilities. All four of my grandparents were atheists, and I live in a country where all of our prime ministers were either atheists or totally secular. So God and religion never had any presence in my life, and there's no reason for me to define myself by negating them. To say it differently, calling myself atheist would make as much sense as calling myself a Guatemalan. It is technically true, I am not Guatemalan, but what would be the point of defining myself in that way? Well, you might say, those are semantics. You don't believe in God's existence, so you are no different from those who define themselves as atheists. Well, not quite, because an atheist is someone who would change their identity if the existence of God was proven to them. Whereas if God revealed himself to me in a burning bush and said, "I am God," I'd be like, "Good for you, I don't give a damn." The question of God's existence is purely academic to me, and has no relevance to my identity. I'll just register the fact that God exists, and carry on being the Nietzschean that I am today. For me, the question should not be whether you're an atheist, but what kind of atheist you are. Being an atheist is merely freedom from, it just defines what you are not. And as Nietzsche says, freedom from doesn't matter much. What matters is the freedom to, the way of life that you choose to have. Admittedly, most people seem happy enough going through life without answering this question. They just go about their daily existence, with their family, friends and hobbies, and that's enough for them. But those of us who want more than that, those who want spiritual transcendence, those who want a moral compass to guide them, need a metaphysical system to live by. In other words, they need a system of thought that arranges the physical world and explains it, and determines how we should act in it. Now, the question is, how do you choose between the different metaphysical theories? Well, the answer is that it kind of chooses you. You encounter a metaphysical theory that speaks to your intuitions, that best explains the world as you experience it. In my case, it is Nietzsche's metaphysics. I've made a video that explains a bit of it, and I'll expand more on it in the future. Now, by adopting Nietzsche's metaphysics, does that mean that I believe that the universe is made of will to power? Not really. It's most probably not true. But the way that Nietzsche explains the universe, based on this theory, speaks to my intuitions, and I feel like it's the closest theory that we have to the truth. More importantly, it allows the spiritual powers that I feel in me to express themselves, without harming myself or others. And so I choose to have faith in it, and act as if it is true. It gives me a compass on how to live my life. I believe that this is what Professor Jordan Peterson is trying to say about Christian metaphysics, although he isn't very good at articulating it. Peterson presents a curious challenge to the atheist community. He comes from the Jungian school of psychoanalysis, which claims that the human species, in the process of evolution, has developed some collective archetypes, which govern our psychology. The story of Christ, argues Peterson, is the best manifestation of these archetypes, and thus the Christian way of life is the best to ensure well-being. So, because it corresponds to his intuitions, Peterson adopts Christian metaphysics. Since he believes that it touches the roots of our psychology, it is for him the truest metaphysics, even if God doesn't exist and Jesus never lived. In other words, Peterson provides an argument for Christianity based on evolution, not on theology, and in that he plays in the atheist ballpark and challenges them. Some in the atheist sphere had risen to meet this challenge, and I have seen a few good and thoughtful rebuttals of Peterson's position. But some new atheists are having none of it, and it wasn't hard to guess who would be the one leading the charge.
So people often ask me, do you believe in God?
It's pronounced God and not God.
Which I don't like that question.
Of course you don't, Jordan, because this is the game you play. It's the game where you put the questioner on trial. A normal question, do you believe in God? What do you mean by believe? What do you mean by God?
First of all, it's an attempt to box me in a sense.
It's an attempt to ask a normal question to a person that you thought was normal before they struck that pose with their hand and said, I deny the validity of the question.
But strangely enough, just as we were talking, the answer to that question popped into my head.
For fuck's sake.
Oh, really? Did it? Did it pop into the body or to the head?
Stay off the fucking set, man.
I act as if God exists.
You don't fucking understand.
Great. What a fucking workaround that was. I act as if? What, you're a Pascal wager dude? Fucking hell. God, I hope that bush behind him turns out to be a Venus flytrap and it just engulfs his head.
You're unbelievable, man. You're unfucking believable.
Now you can decide for yourself whether that means that I believe in him.
I decided that you're an idiot by you saying, I act as if God... Just answer the question.
So that was Devon Tracy. Atheism is unstoppable, being his usual obnoxious and hilarious self. Devon is not just funny, he is also a very intelligent guy. But, if you have been watching him for a while, you might have noticed by now that he never changes. His videos today are pretty much the same as they were 3 years ago, expressing the same themes and positions. There is no development, no expansion, and that is a real shame for someone who is so smart and talented. This is what happens when you block any other worldview from entering your world. You remain confined and stuck in one place. Why do Devon and others reject such positions outright? I think that they believe that skepticism means that you should not commit to any metaphysics, since it cannot be proven. If the only thing I have to go on is intuition, they reason, then it isn't a rational choice, then it is more like faith. And so they reject it. But is their position really the rational position? Isn't it rational to want to live the best life possible, a life full of powerful spiritual experiences? And if refusing to commit to anything prevents you from having those experiences, isn't it irrational to remain in this position? Being a skeptic doesn't necessarily mean that you can't believe in anything. It can also mean that once you've adopted a certain metaphysics, you don't have blind faith in it, but treat it with skepticism. And that essentially means 3 things. 1. That you realize that it is not a universal truth, but belongs only to you and others who find it suitable. So you must not try to impose it on other people. 2. It means that you must not bind yourself to it, but keep on checking yourself and ask if this metaphysics still sufficiently explains real-world facts, or if it is good for your well-being. If it isn't, then you should discard it. And 3. It should not lead you to do immoral things. If you can't find a way to interpret it in a moral fashion, then it should be discarded. I demand the same from others. I am a pluralist, and I believe that anyone should hold the metaphysics that is best for them. If you find religion to be the thing that feels most real to you, the thing that makes you the happiest, then the rational thing for you to do is to be religious. But you must remember that it is only right for you and for those who are like you. You must not try to impose it on others, and you must not lean on it to justify moral actions. If you do, then you become my enemy. Now, some of you might claim that there is a problem with my stance. Since I am a pluralist, I should presumably also believe in moral relativism. Since morality is derived from metaphysics, then having a different metaphysics would lead to a different moral system. Which means that I cannot judge the morality of someone who has a different metaphysics from me. But I disagree. Morality is universal, and is above any metaphysics. For an explanation, check out this video. The idea that faith is diametrically opposed to reason is very old. What indeed does Athens to do with Jerusalem? Asked Tertullian in the 3rd century AD. Some people are under the impression that Western civilization is a conflict between two opposing traditions, the tradition of reason that originated in Athens, and the tradition of faith that originated in Jerusalem, and that one must triumph over the other. But even a superficial glance at history reveals that this is nonsense. Athens and Jerusalem are intertwined to such an extent that they are inseparable. Every Western culture nowadays has some Judeo-Christian and some Greco-Roman influences in it. Those are not two diametrically opposed worlds. The stigma of the Middle Ages is that it was ruled by faith alone, that the Catholic Church determined that God exists because that is what the Bible tells us, and that the Bible tells us the truth because it was given to us by God, and if you don't agree with this solid logic, you are hereby summoned to the nearest Inquisition office to be educated about it. Now that did happen in some times and places, but it is not a fair characterization. The Catholic Church did not think that faith is opposed to reason, but that they are compatible. Rational proofs for the existence of God were provided, to ease the doubts of skeptics. And if we look back at the knowledge of that time, the paradigms of thought that were in place, the arguments for the existence of God were indeed much stronger than the arguments for his inexistence, so intelligent people tended to be believers. This is actually the case up until the 18th century. In the 16th century, however, there was a sharp rise in skepticism, and the religious dogmas came under attack. God's existence was also questioned, and in the 17th century, two French philosophers tried to find rational ways to defeat the skeptics. One was Blaise Pascal, who used mathematics to argue that it is still better to believe in God, even though he conceded that his existence cannot be proven. The other was René Descartes, who tried to take the skeptics' weapon and use it against them, to use skepticism and reason to prove the existence of God. Since this method he was about to present required of him to cast doubt on the usual proofs, Descartes needed to convince the religious establishment of the merit of his endeavor. In a letter to the Faculty of Theology in Paris, Descartes wrote that, although it is absolutely true that we must believe that there is a God, because we are so taught in the Holy Scriptures, and, on the other hand, that we must believe the Holy Scriptures because they come from God, we nevertheless could not place this argument before infidels, who might accuse us of reasoning in a circle. In other words, while I, Descartes, totally believe in the soundness of this theological argument, they, the infidel skeptics, will never be convinced by it. So we need to use reason to convince them of the existence of God. In that, Descartes got license to put reason on the same level as faith, and pretty much set the Age of Enlightenment in motion. There is this notion going around in the atheist community, as if the Age of Enlightenment was on its way to destroy religion once and for all, by showing that reason can explain the universe. But then came Immanuel Kant, at the end of the 18th century, and by putting limits on the ability of human reason to understand the universe, brought religion back. This claim hurts my brain whenever I hear it, and I think it originates in Stephen Hicks, who in his book about postmodernism defines Kant as an anti-Enlightenment philosopher. As evidence, he quotes one line from Kant, who said, "I here therefore found it necessary to deny knowledge to make room for faith." And here, according to Hicks, began our gradual detachment from reason, leading to postmodernism. So let's set things straight. It's not that Kant brought faith back into a philosophical world that was dominated by atheism. On the contrary, the philosophers of Enlightenment had certainty in the existence of God, which they believed they could prove with reason. And only based on that certainty could they establish their belief that reason can fully explain the universe. It was only because they reasoned that God, in his goodness, created us in a way that our mind is capable of understanding the universe and capable of identifying truth when we can see it, that they could argue for the power of human reason. Kant, following David Hume, exposed the limits of human reason, and in that he once and for all debunked all the proofs of God's existence, or inexistence. After Kant, it is pretty much unanimously agreed that we can't answer this question. So yes, Kant also destroyed the belief that our mind can fully understand the universe. But the other thing he did was open the door to atheism. When you remove the certainty in God's existence, it does indeed bring faith back in, and Kant was a man of faith. but it also brings the atheists in. Once the Enlightenment put reason above all, and once reason could no longer substantiate the existence of God, that is when religion took a blow. And this happens only post-Kant. The two main philosophers that tried to find new directions for philosophy following Kant's critique were Hegel and Schopenhauer. And in the wake of Hegel came Marx, and in the wake of Schopenhauer came Nietzsche. Those were the four most influential philosophers of the 19th century, and they were all atheists. The most notable religious philosopher of the century was Kierkegaard, and he admitted that there is no way to rationally substantiate his belief. It requires a leap of faith to continue to be a religious man. In the 19th century, then, we see a reversal to what we saw in the Middle Ages. Now, the ruling paradigm made the atheist argument stronger and more convincing. Religion became a matter of choice, and, like I said earlier, it is a rational choice as long as you realize that it's a private choice. But there were also those who made rational arguments for why we should all keep the faith, although they no longer based their arguments on truth, but on other values. They claimed that without God, life would have no meaning, or that society would crumble, or that we would have no basis for our morality. Thus, religion survived, and kept on being a strong force in Western society. Atheist thought tried to fortify itself against these religious critics. Hegel, Schopenhauer, Marx and others still thought that they could establish certainty, and that we can conduct our lives according to this certainty. With no heavenly afterlife to aspire to, thinkers aspired instead to perfect man, and create a utopia on earth, in which we will be eternally happy. But Nietzsche, at the end of the century, asserted that they were all simply still bound to old ideas. Without God there can be no certainty, and all of our thoughts and beliefs are just our own creation. We need to adjust our perception accordingly, because otherwise our civilization will crumble. In the first half of the 20th century, this realization led to a serious crisis in Western thought. By the second half of the century, however, atheist thought recovered, and started to take over. In the US, religion remained strong, but in Europe it began to diminish fast. We realized that we don't need certainty or utopianism in order to establish morality, purpose and meaning, or to arrange our society. This led to the rise of pluralistic thought, the realization that any metaphysics is valid if it makes you happy, and as long as it doesn't try to encroach on others. The metaphysics at the basis of science is superior when it comes to having a common ground that our society is based on, but privately, individuals and groups can choose whatever metaphysics is good for them. But this also brought a rise in religious fundamentalism, i.e. religious movements that believe that the Holy Scriptures can provide certainty. The fundamentalists are incapable of perceiving that life can be lived without certainty or utopianism. Because of that, they mistook the developments in the secular world as a sign that secular society has become spiritually impoverished, and is ready to be conquered by a religious thought that provides certainty. The worst manifestation of this comes from Islam, but Christianity and Judaism underwent the same process. In the US, the evangelicals became so strong that they managed to get George W. Bush, a very religious man, elected as president. I remember watching Bush giving an interview on Israeli TV before the Iraq invasion, where he stated that he believes that God has given him a mission to bring democracy to the Middle East. I remember thinking, oh dear, this is the Middle East, and this guy thinks it's the Blues Brothers. This was when I realized that the Americans were going into Iraq based on faith that things are going to work out, not on a thought-out plan, and that it will not end well. But this fundamentalist rise ended up harming religion, as the immoral actions performed by fundamentalists multiplied, making religion itself seem immoral. Furthermore, the fundamentalists stepped out of the boundaries of religion, and that made atheists fight back. The pluralistic spirit of the late 20th century made seculars more tolerant of religion, but once religion tried to impose itself, the atheists went on the counterattack to defend pluralism. I doubt that Richard Dawkins, for instance, would have left his lab and gone on his atheist crusade if it wasn't for all the creationists trying to introduce the pseudoscientific mumbo-jumbo into his field of research. And so we got the new atheists, who are driven by the belief that religion is inherently immoral and should therefore be defeated. With the new tool called the internet at their disposal, the new atheists are having a significant effect. For the first time, we are seeing atheist voices rise in the Muslim world, and in the US, the power of religion has diminished greatly in the last decade. I see that as a generally positive development. I believe that religion can be a force for the good, as long as it doesn't have political power. When they don't have political power, religious people tend to focus on the positive parts of their religion, and express their religiosity by doing good deeds. When they have political power, on the other hand, they feel compelled to go out and try to impose their beliefs on the world. So the aim of new atheism should be not to eradicate religion, but to cut it down to size. A person who believes that he knows what God's plan for him is, like George W. Bush, should be someone that the public will consider too dangerous to lead them. With the decline of religion in the US, I believe that the American public will be more wary of such candidates from now on. But now that atheism is a force in America, and on the internet, atheists should remember that with power comes responsibility. First and foremost, you should maintain your skepticism, and not treat your atheism like it's the one and only truth. You should also not base your idea of religious people on those fundamentalists which we have been fighting. There are many people who combine religious faith with skeptical thought. And finally, as I said in the beginning, open yourself up to metaphysics. Don't be like Buridan's ass, refusing to commit to anything and remaining stuck in one place. Again, it's not for everyone, but if you hear that call, if you want more spirituality in your life, you can answer it without feeling like you are betraying your reason. As long as you maintain your skepticism, it is a rational choice. Your life will become richer as a result, and you will also be more immune from falling into blind faith in unsavory ideas. The atheist SJWs are an example for what happens when you don't maintain your skepticism, and don't tend to your spiritual side. Instead, they quench their thirst for meaning by adopting neo-Marxist metaphysics, and adopting it wholesale without any skepticism. They act like believers who have blind faith, and they try to impose their neo-Marxist values on the rest of the world. Most of all, they are harming themselves. Instead of developing and expanding their spirit, they are caught in a process of restricting and diminishing it more and more, to avoid offending others. But since a diminished spirit is less capable of taking offense, it is a vicious circle that will never end, and will lead to total degradation. But here is where the power of pluralism reveals itself. People tend to moan about the problems of a pluralist society, about how supposedly weak it is for being so disintegrated. But actually, a pluralist society is very powerful in defending itself. Because once one of its cultures goes crazy, the other cultures can ally together to defeat it. We were allied in beating back the Christian fundamentalists, and now that part of the left is going crazy and regressive, we liberals can ally with the religious to beat it back. This can only happen in a pluralist society, and this is why I have faith in pluralism. And this is also a good opportunity to open our minds and learn. This development has introduced us to thoughtful religious voices, those whose faith isn't blind, but is accompanied by skeptical thinking. Don't reject religious voices outright. That only shows that you are insecure in your atheist identity. Where I agree with Jordan Peterson is that I think that religious thought has something to contribute to Western society, and it's good to have it as part of the conversation. The dialogue between Athens and Jerusalem must go on. It's what Western civilization is built on.